now to the panel. Yes, we have Sarah Barker, who is the partner and head of climate risk governance at Minter Ellison. She's also the Australia's representative on the cross-jurisdictional Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, the CCLI. And also we have Ernest Lim, who is my colleague over at National University of Singapore Faculty of Law. He has recently written a legal opinion together with Jeffrey Chan and a few Singapore legal practitioners on the director's responsibilities and climate change under Singapore law. And yeah, so that's the Chan opinion he'll be sharing. Together with Sarah and Ernest, we also have Ellie Mulholland, who is the senior associate at Minter Ellison at the London office. So we have someone from Australia, someone from Singapore, and someone from London. She's also the executive director of the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative. And they will be sharing perspectives from the 3 different jurisdictions. I'll turn the mic over to Sarah.
Thank you very much. It seems like there's been a disproportionate discussion of Australian directors' duties today, given our significance in the world economy, but I think there's a very good reason for that. And the reason for that is that outside the US, we are the 2nd largest class action jurisdiction. We've got very permissive laws that enable plaintiffs to bring actions against boards, shareholder derivative actions for breach of duty, but also to bring class actions against companies and directors directly in relation to misleading disclosure or securities fraud. And so we're a very favourable jurisdiction when it comes to litigation against directors. To give you a little bit more of a context of how the obligations of directors in Australia have developed, taking Martin's point that it's very important to consider the context in which duties apply, just to remind you of a few characteristics of the Australian economy and where climate change sits in relation to the Australian economy. So, as you would know, we are a very resource-dependent economy. We have very significant extractive industries. Most of our export income comes from the export of thermal coal, metallurgical coal, natural gas, and iron ore, which is, of course, reduced using metallurgical coal to make steel. We're so reliant on these commodities that Schroders has in fact ranked our stock exchange as the most significantly exposed to stranded asset risks of any of the industrialised economies across the world. So that's a first bit of context to keep in mind. The second bit of context is that climate change is a highly politicised issue in Australia. It's been held up as being responsible for the downfalls of 3 of our last 4 prime ministers. We're the only developed economy to have had a carbon tax and then repealed it. And the way in which the public discourse around climate change has played out in the media has historically been very emotive, very vitriolic, and very polarised in this very simple trade-off between money and nature. The last piece of information to keep in mind is that we do not have federal regulatory or policy leadership in relation to climate change. So if you think of that context, it's not surprising that in 2014, we're in a position where we've repealed our carbon tax. I would walk into a boardroom as a corporate lawyer and try to talk to directors about the financial risks associated with climate change and why it was an essential element of discharging their duties that they consider these risks. And I would get very puzzled looks. Why is there a corporate lawyer asking us about or telling us about climate change and why we need to think about it? That was 2014. We're now in a position where we still have no federal regulation. We're still a very resource-dependent country, I beg your pardon. There's still a lot of vitriolic discourse in the media. But we're now at the point where there is mainstream recognition that not only do directors have a positive obligation to consider climate change as an element of discharging their duty of due care and diligence. But that standard has been elevated to such an extent that the obligation now includes one to consider net zero targets and whether or not their business is required to set net zero targets, given the evolution of the economics of this issue in recent times. So how do we get there? Between 2014, where it was almost a swear phrase to say climate change, to now, where there is this mainstream recognition amongst the business community. And the answer to that is primarily due to a strategy that sought to reconcile the difference between stakeholder theory and shareholder primacy theory by recognising that in a modern economy where there is natural resource scarcity and where there is the internet, that means you can't hide, uber transparency, that responsible action on climate change, not only in the long term, but certainly with economic transition risk in the short and medium term, is an essential predeterminant of financial wealth maximisation. Now, with my colleagues at CCLI and Minter Ellison, we instructed a very senior lawyer in Australia, Noel Hutley SC, who was at that time the president of the Australasian Bar Association. We presented him back in 2016 with a brief of information on how climate change had evolved from being a purely environmental, non-financial, moral, ethical, lefty, hippie, greenie issue about polar bears to one that presented material financial risks for business within mainstream investment horizons. And Mr. Hutley opined, given that brief of evidence, that it was open to a court to determine that a failure to consider climate-related risk by a director would be a breach of their duty of due care and diligence. And it was only just in this last month that Mr. Hutley updated that opinion, looking at the developments not only in Australia, attitudes amongst the business community, attitudes of the corporate regulators, ASIC, APRA, Accounting Standards Board, our Reserve Bank, who all incidentally relied on the first Hutley opinion as cover to be able to come out and say, well, Noel Hutley said this, and that represents our approach to enforcement policy. Because of all these developments, the standard of care has continued to elevate. And now with 2/3 of the global economy having set down net zero by 2050, or in the case of China, 2060 policies as part of their core economic strategy, Mr. Hutley has opined that if you are not now considering the impact of net zero on your business strategy and ability to continue to generate financial wealth, you are likely to be in breach of your duties as a director.
Thanks, Sarah. Ernest, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I've been asked to speak about the Singapore legal opinion on climate change and what Singapore's largest controlling shareholder of state-owned enterprises, namely Temasek, has done to address climate-related risks. So Singapore is a concentrated ownership jurisdiction, unlike the UK and the US. The majority of listed companies in Singapore are state-owned enterprises, also known as SOEs, and family-owned companies. Given the importance of SOEs, it is crucial to understand the role of the state as the controlling shareholder and regulator. Now, let me first discuss the legal opinion. We have been requested by the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative to issue this opinion. The legal opinion, of which the former Deputy Solicitor General and myself are among the co-authors, demonstrates that in view of the well-established physical, transition, and liability risks associated with climate change, and in light of the measures taken by the Singapore government and regulators to address these risks, directors of companies are and should be required under Singapore law to take into account climate-related risks in their decision-making process, failing which they will be liable for breaching their duties to the company. Now, the legal opinion also shows that failing to disclose climate-related risks may amount to a breach of the Singapore Exchange continuous disclosure requirements and the rules on sustainable reporting guide. In 2017, 8 central banks and financial supervisors, including the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is Singapore's equivalent of the Bank of England, established a network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system. And in 2020, the Monetary Authority of Singapore issued environmental risk management guidelines across the banking, insurance, and asset management sectors. These include expectations that directors and senior management of these financial institutions should maintain oversight of their environmental risk management. Under the guidelines, directors should approve an environmental risk management framework and policies to assess and manage environmental risk exposures, ensure that material environmental risk is addressed, set clear roles and responsibilities of board and senior management, including personnel who are responsible for oversight of the environmental risk, and ensure adequate management expertise and resources for managing environmental risks. Singapore also has other legislation to address climate-related risks, such as Carbon Pricing Act, Energy Conservation Act, Transboundary Haze Pollution Act, and Resource Sustainability Act. Now, so these are some of the measures taken by the Singapore government. I now want to highlight 2 points in the legal opinion. Under Singapore Companies Act, a director must at all times act honestly and use reasonable diligence in the discharge of the duties of his office. Acting honestly means the duty to act in good faith in a company's best interests. There is an objective and subjective component to that test. Subjectively, it means whether the director himself or herself consider the action to be in the company's interests. Objectively, it means whether an honest and intelligent person in the director's position believed the transaction was for the company's benefit. The duty to exercise reasonable diligence is interpreted objectively, whether the director has exercised the same degree of care and diligence as a reasonable director found in his or her position. This standard is not fixed, but context-specific depending on the type of company. The legal opinion states that the failure to take into account climate-related risks, insofar as these risks have a material and adverse impact on the financial performance of the company, will render the director in breach of both common law and statutory duties. The consequences are grave. The director may be fined or jailed or disqualified under the Companies Act. The opinion also states that it is impossible for directors to take the position that it is unnecessary for them to consider climate change in the governance of their companies. They cannot say that they are unaware of climate change risks and how these can impact on their companies. The second highlight of the legal opinion is this. The Singapore Exchange listing rules require companies to disclose developments that affect materially the present or potential risks or interests of the issuer's shareholders. Climate change is certainly one such development. A breach of the listing rule, which is not intentional or reckless, can result in a fine on the company, but if the breach is false or misleading in any material aspect and is likely to induce a person to buy the securities or alter the market price of the securities, the director can be fined or jailed if he has consented or connived at the company's commission of the offense. I would like now to set out what Temasek, Singapore's controlling shareholder of the SOEs, has done to address climate-related risks. For itself, Temasek already achieved carbon neutrality last year. For its portfolio companies, which include but are not limited to the SOEs, Temasek has pledged to deliver net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Regarding governance, Temasek's board has oversight of its financial and systemic risks arising from climate change which can impact the value of its portfolio over the long term. Regarding strategy, one notable feature that Temasek has incorporated climate scenario analysis alongside macroeconomic or geopolitical events within the Temasek geometric expected return model, which uses a scenario-based approach to simulate its 20-year long-term expected returns. Regarding metric and targets, with respect to emissions relating to Thom's portfolio companies, Temasek is actually working with an internationally recognized consultant to review the total attributable carbon emissions using weighted average carbon intensity as the metric, but no specific targets are set. To conclude, the lesson is that in concentrated ownership jurisdictions where controlling shareholders are the norm, which is the state of affairs in many countries around the world, the state as the controller plays a critical role in achieving net zero carbon emission in its portfolio companies. And it's important to continually hold the state accountable for its action and inaction.
Thanks, Ernest. Thanks for sharing on the Singapore perspective. Now we move on to London. I'll call upon Ellie to share her views on the London approach.
Thanks, Lulu, for the invitation to speak. I'm here today to provide some comments on these issues from a UK law perspective, but you might have noticed my accent. Yes, I am an Australian qualified lawyer, but I am dialing in from my home in London. And although I don't advise on UK law, I spend a lot of time thinking, reading, writing, and speaking on it. So here in the UK, the two most relevant directors' duties are under the Companies Act. The first is the Section 172 duty to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole, which is a fiduciary duty. There is an express obligation under Section 172 to have regard to certain factors when acting in good faith to promote the success of the company. These factors include the impact of the company's operations on the community and the environment, and the likely long-term consequences of the decision. And climate change is relevant for both of these factors, is often relevant. And the other duty is the Section 174 duty to exercise reasonable care, skill, and diligence. And given what the Bank of England tells us about the breadth, depth, and magnitude of climate risks to entities across the whole economy, directors should consider climate risks when fulfilling their duties under both Section 172 and Section 174. Now, today I want to draw your attention to 5 developments which I would suggest heighten the standard of care and consideration to which UK directors must bring to bear on climate risks and climate change. Then I want to suggest that the endogenous nature of climate risk as a financial and systemic risk further heightens the actions required of banks, insurers, and high-emitting firms, which would in turn impact on the standard of care directors of those companies must take in overseeing the climate risk management and climate strategy. But first, a comment on liability, and this might pick up what Brett was saying earlier. Unlike in Australia, there is no public enforcement of directors' duties in the UK, and the procedural hurdles for shareholder derivative actions are very high. But there is a difference between the standard of responsibility and the practical likelihood of liability. Directors should aim to satisfy the standard of responsibility required to fulfill their duties, even if it's likely that only the most egregious of breaches, or some might say the most unlikely of directors, might face actual liability. So what are these 5 developments that heighten the standard of care and consideration? The first is that the TCFD will be mandatory across the UK economy. In accordance with the UK government's TCFD roadmap, it will extend beyond premium listed issuers, as it does today, to apply to a wider group of companies, banks, insurers, pension funds, and asset managers by 2025. So for companies, the UK regulator, the FCA, has said that these TCFD disclosures, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, one of the alphabet soups Brett mentioned earlier, they should be in the strategic report. Now, in order for directors to sign off on that report, they must act with due care, skill, and diligence to ensure that the processes underlying those TCFD disclosures are robust and reasonable. The second is financial statement integration. And last year, the International Accounting Standards Body, the IFRS trustees, released educational materials on how the requirements of existing IFRS accounting standards apply to climate issues. This brings climate within audit remit, and Big Four auditors in the UK are increasingly raising climate issues as a key audit matter. And an influential coalition of investors have called on the largest multinational companies to produce Paris-aligned accounts. And the third is the market signal from governments setting net zero emissions targets. UK companies now operate in a jurisdiction with a net zero emissions target set in law. And this is an issue for multinationals and global supply chains. Even when the US sets a target as flagged, 9 of the world's 10 largest economies will have net zero emissions targets. So directors need to consider how to guide their companies through the disruption so that their companies not only survive, but thrive in the transition. The fourth is escalating regulatory and shareholder expectations for scenario analysis and climate transition plans. In July 2020, the Bank of England PRA wrote in their Dear CEO letter that banks and insurers in the UK were not moving fast enough in their efforts to manage climate-related financial risks in accordance with its supervisory expectations. And it said that firms have until the end before the introduction of a supervisory ratchet. And under the auspices of the Climate Action 100 Plus, investors controlling $52 trillion US dollars are assessing companies' strategies and disclosures against a net zero benchmark. And this is so with Chevron and Exxon AGMs yesterday shared in the chat. Investors are voting for shareholder resolutions and for nominee directors to shake up climate transition plans. And now we have the IEA's net zero emissions scenario, which sets out an emissions pathway that gives us an even chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Previously, companies relied on IEA forecasts and scenarios to inform their forward-looking assessment of prices, asset valuations, and corporate strategies. And for these companies, I would suggest that a failure of directors now to have regard to the IEA's new net zero emissions scenario in their governance, strategy, risk management, and disclosure practice would be manifestly unreasonable. And the fifth is climate litigation, particularly with yesterday's landmark Shell ruling in the Netherlands. By ordering Shell to reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030, it acknowledged that this would have a significant impact on Shell's growth and corporate strategy. But it's an indicator required to do across the globe. So I would argue that these 5 developments suggest that the standard and consideration is heightened for all UK directors. Tease out that standard further, and this takes me to directors of banks, insurers, and high-emitting companies. Lord Sales of the UK Supreme Court discussed this extracurricularly in August 2019. As things stand, there is much force in the view that directors may and increasingly must take into account and accord significant weight to climate change in their decision making. So how much weight? The UK is not a shareholder premises jurisdiction, but rather, and they have enlightened shareholder value. Now, thinking back to the Section 172 factors, including the impacts on the community and the environment, it could be open to a company director to decide when promoting the success of their company that other factors outweigh the impact of the company's operations on climate change, such as the need to provide short-term shareholder returns or to provide ongoing employment for its workforce operating a carbon-intensive asset. But back to Lord Sales. His Honour said that under certain circumstances, however, their company's interests may be so implicated by climate change effects that their general fiduciary and due care obligations actually require them to cause their companies to take action to reduce their contribution to climate changing activity. Now, I think what His Honour is alluding to is the idea that externalities can be directly internalised, for example, by means of a carbon price or compensatory damages for causing or contributing to climate impacts, such as the litigation of approximately 20 US cities and states against carbon majors. But I also want to suggest that the externalities might also be indirectly internalised through the endogenous nature of climate risk. In a 2018 report, the Bank of England, decisions that we take today in part determine the magnitude of climate-related financial risk. And in this way, climate risk is not just like any other financial risk. And I think that it's not just transition risk that can be internalised, but physical risk too, particularly when we work on medium and long-term investment planning and planning horizons. So our understanding that climate risks involve radical uncertainty and endogenous risks suggests that some directors do more. These could include UK directors of high-emitting companies, as well as banks and insurers that finance high-emitting companies and which are themselves exposed to systemic risks if climate risks materialise on a sufficient scale. And I would suggest that these directors may and increasingly must act to reduce their impacts on climate change, to help finance and bring about the net zero transitions their governments want to bring about in a way that limits warming to 1.5 degrees in order to promote the success of their companies. So I'll end there and pass back to Lulu for discussion.
Thanks, Ellie. I think we have heard from all the three speakers that I think the main issue is actually about enforcement. How do you actually enforce it against the directors? And there's variations between having public enforcement in Australia and the rest of the places where, you know, you still have to resort to company law. So my question is, how would it only be for major carbon majors company that has to make changes, or you know, because of litigation, the fear of litigation in Australia? But what about the other rest of the companies, you know, where they are not carbon majors, but you know, do they have to take that into consideration as well?
Oh, absolutely. If you think about, say, for example, the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, it identifies 12 industry sectors as being at high risk of exposure to material climate-related financial risks. Of course, businesses involved in the extraction of hydrocarbons or the combustion of hydrocarbon, but industries like agriculture, estate, infrastructure, banking and finance, logistics, construction materials, the list goes on and on. Similarly, in the US, SASB originally back in 2016 and then recently updated a study where it looked at the US economy across 9 sectors and concluded that climate change presents material financial risks in 74 out of those 79 sectors. So when I'm advising boards, the question really isn't, is climate change a material risk for your company? Rather, why wouldn't it be a material risk for your company?
But I think at the end of the day, it's actually a matter of balance. I think a lot of the attendees actually said, you know, the duty to promote the success of the company, like what you said, you know, at the end of the day, it's a matter of balance, because if it really depends on how involved your company is in, you know, in emitting carbon and all that kind of thing. All right. There's a question for Ernest from Paul. Let's see. It says. Let me see, because it moves so fast, there are just so many questions. Okay, Ernest, is your sense that having largely state-owned listed companies make things easier here or harder? It presumably means votes will never go against the company's view, and the courts may be less willing to enforce against a state-owned business. On the other hand, I guess that if the state is serious about climate change, then this will come through. So, Ernest, you want to say something on this?
Yes.
I think, Jill, you may have to mute yourself, Jill, unless you want to say something. Can I invite Ernest first, and then maybe Jill, you want to say something? We can, yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Lulu, and also thanks, Chris Hilson, for this really important question. It's double-edged sword. So if the state, as the controlling shareholder and as the regulator, is serious about the transition to a net zero carbon economy, it can take rather decisive actions, which is the case in Singapore, and which is the case in Temasek, which is a controlling shareholder of the SOEs in Singapore. However, if the state is not serious or merely pays lip service to the transition to a net zero carbon economy, or the state takes selected enforcement action against certain companies, but not against itself due to conflicts of interest, then that will not achieve the goal of a net zero carbon economy. So I would say that it is a double-edged sword, depending on the competence and the integrity of the government. Yes.
Right. Ellie, do you have anything to say on this as well? I know, you know, in UK, a state is not a big thing, but what is your opinion on what has been said by, you know, Ernest?
I think the controlling shareholder arguments are really interesting. It's interesting to see where we need to do that comparative law and comparative circumstance, and where we can draw on these being global issues that have unique implications according to different regions and different entities and firms. And I think Ernest in his scholarship has really added to this specific type of comparative issue. But I think that there's a lot that we can kind of go above and be we can step up and either look at it as a global trend, because we generally are talking about multinational companies with global supply chains, or then we're actually looking at a very specific level. So I think it's interesting when we go that level of analysis, or when we can actually just look at macro trends as well.
Thanks, Ellie. I think what I've heard so far is that probably corporate law is still a bit too blunt in in being enforced against corporate company directors. Maybe we need to resort to other kind of law, like what Ellie has shared. What is your opinion? Okay. Maybe I can ask Sarah, ask Ernest to voice a little bit on this. Maybe not corporate law, but environmental law or any other law?
Yeah, it's interesting to see actually in recent days the influence of human rights law, for example, in this space. So I think with Paris Agreement targets was a breach of obligations under the Dutch Civil Code, the duty of care owed to Dutch citizens, and in breach of international soft law instruments in relation to human rights. Similar on a human rights front today in Australia, there was a judgment handed down, an administrative law judgment, in which it was held that the Minister for the Environment is required to consider the risk to children, of risk to their health and to their life associated with the risks associated with climate change, and take those risks into account in considering whether or not to approve or disapprove the expansion of a thermal coal mine. So a conclusion that the Minister has a duty of care to the children of Australia to take their health interests into account in approving a thermal coal mine. So I think we can look at these laws as necessarily being broad, necessarily being normative. Certainly the corporate law is designed to be broad and normative so it can flex to different circumstances that arise. And what we're now seeing is climate change being applied as the catalyst for breach of very established areas of law, whether it's corporate law because it's evolved to be a financial risk, whether it's human rights law because of the impact to human health in particular. I'm quite comfortable with the law being broad and blunt. I think it's just a matter, as you mentioned in your introductory comments, a failure of enforcement, I think, is really what is holding the law back at the moment.
Thanks, Sarah. What about Brett and Martin? Do you have anything to share on this as well?
Well, I mean, this question of enforcement it's something that Claire and I have written about together, and Claire separately on sort of, Claire has a paper on Caremark as soft law. So it's clearly true in the United States that the enforcement, basically it's the business judgment rule. So and it, so you can, if you have a company that wants to be aggressive in responding to climate change, you can. If you don't want to be, you're not going to be successfully sued as a matter of fiduciary duty, I think is where things stand. You know, there's a sort of a soft law component on to what, you know, there is a duty to, you know, exercise due care. And if climate change is indeed having a major ongoing impact, or will be having a major impact on the sort of profitability of companies, there is an expectation that you need to do something about it. And the question really is, are the mechanisms very strong to, in the absence of enforcement, to get boards and officers focused on that? And that, you know, that's what we're trying to determine. And to my sense, it's still sort of an open question. I don't see signs that it's having huge impact yet, but people are paying a lot of attention to it. It's getting it, you know, and maybe that in the end is going to have an impact. I still don't think that is a substitute for a carbon tax or, you know, really serious carbon regulation. I just don't think it's a substitute for that.
I do think we underestimate the potential quasi-enforcement role that insurers in this regard, and financial lines insurers in particular. We saw in relation to cyber attack, for example, insurance companies had foreseen the degree to which cyber attack would become a claim against directors and officers. They hadn't provisioned for it within their policies, and those policies, of course, have a 6-year tail because they're policies, and found that they hadn't priced those risks in and were quite significantly burned. So I'm certainly starting to see a bit of wariness amongst insurers and insurance brokers around, well, how is this climate change catalysed fiduciary litigation going to play out? Is it something that we need to preemptively exclude from our policies so that we're not finding ourselves in the same position as we were with cyber? So my hope is that the grey-suited insurers will ride in on their white horse and force change in a manner that litigation has yet to do.
I want to
something to say. Oh, okay. Maybe Ernest first, and then Marty. Yes.
Okay. I just want to add a quick point, which is that yes, enforcement is very important, whether we are talking about private enforcement or public enforcement of directors' duties. But we cannot underestimate the role of corporate law in generating norms and in guiding behavior. So with regards to the legal opinion, the CEO of Temasek, who was at the webinar whereby the legal opinion was launched, makes the case that directors should take into account climate-related risk in a decision-making process, because this will affect short-term and particularly long-term share value of the company. This is why it should matter. And the CEO of Temasek, which is the controlling shareholder, frame it within a shame. And he said that this is to account climate-related risk. And it's not something, of course, ethics matter, social risk all matter, but ultimately it impacts on long-term shareholder value. And even if no lawsuits are being brought against a state-owned enterprise or against the state as the controlling shareholder, but if the state should set the tone as the controller by saying that taking into account failure to take into account climate-related risks will have an adverse and material impact on the long-term shareholder value, I think that is a powerful message. Thank you.
So I actually wanted to ask a question to Ernest about the opinion that relates closely to what you just said, namely, or maybe that's a general point, namely, how do we identify the injury to a company in a fiduciary lawsuit? To what extent is it necessary? So especially if climate change damage to the company materializes only some years down the road, maybe the directors who were responsible and who did not take action are not in office anymore, right? And I think isn't that a severe limitation of fiduciary duty, and specifically to what the opinion envisions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Martin, because there's extensive literature showing that one of the key problems in succeeding in a lawsuit, whether we are talking about derivative action or we are talking about an environmental lawsuit, is the question of attribution and causation. How do you establish that the losses that have been caused to the company, the financial losses, are attributable to the failure to take into account climate-related risks and exactly what climate-related risks we're talking about? So I think difficult issue, which has actually affected a number of lawsuits around the world. But that said, and I think I agree with that point that the issue of attribution and causation is problematic, and we need to rely more extensive climate science to improve to help us to shed greater on the question of causation. And therefore, I think that lawsuits arising from breach of directors' duties will not be highly successful in a concentrated ownership jurisdiction. And therefore, the mechanism to hold SOEs accountable will be through direct or indirect pressure exerted by the press or by prominent institutional investors, such as by exiting, such as by public criticisms, or even by the public themselves, the citizens themselves, criticisms of the state by the citizens themselves, that could arguably be more powerful and effective than bring derivative action lawsuits.
Thanks, Ernest. I think, yeah, in the interest of time, we have to stop our discussion. It has been really, really exciting. I think you can look from the chat and all that kind of thing. But I think probably we can sum up what we have discussed is that maybe it is still difficult, although there are ways to get directors liable under duty of care. Enforcement may still be an issue, but definitely there will be a heightened attention, okay, on the board, on the part of the board, in dealing with climate change issues. That's for certain in all the 3 jurisdictions that we have surveyed. So thank you very much for my great panelists. I'll pass the time back to Lucas Enriques, who will be giving the closing speech. Thank you.
Actually, I thought Umakanth would take over.
Yeah. Thanks, thanks, Lulu. So I'll just start and then maybe just hand over to Luca. So this is just a final set of words from us, just to bring this wonderful event to a close. I'll take a minute or so and hand over to Luca and Thom. The edit of the OBL were deciding to do a conference. And then the question of what topic do we choose? And we were pretty unanimous that this topic of business law and climate change is the one that's most important for a number of reasons. As we discussed yesterday, the pandemic has only reinforced the importance of climate change rather than distract us from this topic. As we've seen this week, while this conference has been going on, there have been earth-shattering events, so to speak, both from the judiciary and from the corporate perspective. We spoke about Shell today, Chevron and Exxon yesterday, so it couldn't have been more relevant. And then finally, there's going to be this big conference, the COP26 in Glasgow. So a lot of what we've been thinking about is going to be leading up to that. And just to take away from the conference over the last 3 days, certainly we've covered a whole lot of different issues, commitments by companies, disclosure, exit versus voice, and today boardroom issues. It's been truly interdisciplinary. We covered economics on one day. We covered a lot of legal issues today, business issues, and today we also had a comparative analysis. It started from the US and ended up in Australia via the UK and Singapore. So there's been a lot of issues that we've been able to do so. And that's truly the nature of this collaboration that we've had, because we've had Oxford, Hamburg, Berlin, and Singapore involved in putting this conference together under the umbrella of the OBLB. We have to thank innumerable individuals and institutions for this. I won't get into thanking them individually because there are too many to thank, but it's been truly a very collaborative effort. And we really thank all the speakers, the panelists, as well as the audience, for being here. So Luca was the one who kickstarted the conference 3 days ago. So it's befitting that Luca will draw the proceedings to a close along with Thom from Oxford. So over to you, Luca and Thom.
Thom?
Sure, Luca, thank you. And I'll just say some brief words to add to Umakanth's words before Luca can close off. So I think there are a few interesting points coming out of this conference. And the first is that there's actually considerable consensus in terms of the recognition of the problem. And it appears that there's also consensus that regulation will have a role in resolving it. We've covered an incredible range of topics, from how companies manage and disclose climate risk, whether they can commit credibly to transition, how shareholders can help drive change, and what the role of the board and of the fiduciary duties in this context shows you that business law across the board is engaged by the issue of the net zero transition. And that shouldn't be taken for granted, because I think that recognition wasn't always there and is in fact a fairly recent one. Now, it is not to say that events have given us much wiggle room around this issue anyway. As many have alluded to, yesterday was quite a remarkable day for climate lawyers, with developments at Exxon and of course at Shell. And the Shell case in particular is really a milestone. It's the first time that the court holds an energy company or forces an energy company to cut its emissions in this drastic a way. And the target really is ambitious. Note that the court recognized a duty on Shell that is independent from the duties of states, and that's independent of the actions taken by states. And note also how stringent the obligation on Shell now is. It has to cut 45% of its emissions by 2030. As compared to its emissions in 2019. And that includes, or at least there's a strong push for that to include, Scope 3 emissions. So it's a really significant event. And crucially, the court is not giving Shell the opportunity to wait in taking action until the appeal starts. It has to start with this transition straight away. And this is a judgment that, on its face, is not limited to oil majors like Shell, but one that, whose reasoning, the reasoning of which could be applied to all heavy emitters. So it's reasonable to expect more litigation on this front in the Netherlands. And it's also reasonable more generally that the result that has been achieved with this case will embolden further litigation in jurisdictions other than the Netherlands. The legal reasoning in this case is indeed bold, it is contentious, and it will be appealed. But no matter of the appeal, the legal and economic ramifications are already being felt. And companies around the world are on notice that a risk that seemed very remote is now much more proximate. Now, of course, differences in the characterization of the problem of business law and the net zero transition remain, and that should not come as a surprise, because this issue engages so many legal specialisms with their own emphasis. So we have corporate law, securities regulation, financial regulation, and then of course we have the non-legal disciplines that are engaged by this conversation, which include finance and of course also climate science. And each of these disciplines has a particular vantage point. And I think that we have seen at this conference that sometimes these vantage points clash. And the challenge for us as a community of scholars will be to bring out the best of those disciplines and come to an understanding that reflects the best available science in each of these fields. And we hope that by having had this conference focused on the theme of business net zero transition, we managed to catalyze that conversation. The goal to catalyze this conversation is one that at Oxford we are taking very seriously, which is why we have launched recently the Oxford Sustainable Law Program. This program is a partnership between the Faculty of Law and many other institutes across the university, which represents an attempt to really bring together scholars from these diverse fields to push the science and to push the law in this field. And we work very closely with practitioners to make sure that the research that we do is directly relevant to policy and to private practice. Going forward, we hope that the conversation that we kicked off on this conference can continue, and the Oxford Sustainable Law Programme will very happily play a role in making. If you are inspired to work on this field, or if you're on this field and want to keep doing so, please do reach out, because it's so much more interesting to have a critical mass, whether in person or remotely, to keep discussing these issues. And again, we are very happy to facilitate that. I want to end with something that Wetzer, the Dean of the Oxford Law Faculty, said at the beginning of this conference on Tuesday, which is that business law will help shape the net zero transition, but in the same way, the net zero transition will help shape the future direction of business law. And we have seen there's lots of opportunity here. There's also lots of work left to do. So I want the participants, the attendees, and the organizers of this conference, and I want to encourage you and all of us to keep at it in the months and years ahead. Thank you so much, and Luca, over to you.
Thank you, Thom. There is very little left for me to say, also because we don't have much time. We are already running over. I will just say that I think this was an excellent example of a decentralized conference, not just because the organization took place in 3 different jurisdictions, but also because of the quality of the chat-based contributions to the conference. And I am playing with the idea of trying and publish the 3 chats as blog posts, the 3 days chat as blog posts in the Oxford Business Law blog. It will require some editing, a little bit of editing, and some emails to go around, but I think it would be a nice addition to the contribution that this conference has made to people's, to the number of participants' understanding of the issues and what is at stake. So I will end by especially thanking Georg Ringe and the Hamburg team, and also, last but not least, the European Corporate Governance Institute and its team, led by Elaine McPartland. They gave an amazing help in the organization of the conference, which went smoothly, mainly thanks to them and Georg. So Georg, I think as usual, you will send us a link to the Wonder platform so that we can resume our chit-chatting there. Thank you. It was a pleasure to see you, and hope to see you at the Oxford Business Law Conference, but hopefully even before, in person next time.